And just as you think about that, I want you to look around the room and tell me what is real in your room. Or when you wake up in the morning, what kind of a world do you think that you're waking up in? Now, if I had to ask you to describe everything that's real in the room around you, you'd probably look around and you think, well, the books are real, the walls are real, the ceiling's real, the chair's real, the microphone's real, the computer's real, because these are all things that we can see and feel and touch.
I'm still walking. Still walking on.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Between Two Realms. My name's Andre, I'm your host, and let me begin by asking you a kind of simple question, taking you through a little bit of a thought experiment. That's kind of my aim here, is just to introduce a couple of key concepts to you, especially if you're watching this as a Christian. I want you to just take a look around the room that you're sitting in. I don't know, you might be doing anything, you might be sitting on your sofa, you might be watching this on TV, on your phone, on your laptop, whatever it is. And just as you think about that, I want you to look around the room and tell me what is real in your room. Or when you wake up in the morning, what kind of a world do you think that you're waking up in? Now, if I had to ask you to describe everything that's real in the room around you, you'd probably look around and you think, well, the books are real, the walls are real, the ceiling's real, the chair's real, the microphone's real, the computer's real, because these are all things that we can see and feel and touch. But if we truly believe the Bible and all that it has to say about the world that we live in, then we'll understand that in this very room that you're in, I apologize if you're watching this late at night, this might be a slightly creepy idea, but in this world that we live in as Christians, we believe God made things both visible and invisible. And that means that in your room currently are things visible and invisible, and both of those things are real. Now, obviously, we are limited by what we can see, what we can know through our physical senses. And so the way that we know and experience and interact with that world is going to be different, of course. But most of us would probably, and I guess this is the thing, that when we're thinking about the real world, we think about the physical world. We think about the material world, the tangible world. We think about traffic, work, family, emails, shopping, politics, news, or whatever's waiting for us today. Even as Christians, we move through life as though the material world is the only world that really matters. So we don't believe that, at least if you're anything but sort of like a cray-cray classical liberal scholar who maybe rejects all that kind of stuff. You're a Christian, you believe in the invisible realm, and you can't, to be honest, those guys aren't Christians anyway. To be a Christian, you have to believe in the invisible. You have to believe in the spiritual. You have to believe in the supernatural. God, at the very least, fits into that category, but as do realms like heaven and hell, and as do beings like angels and demons. And so, to be honest, it's so key to our faith. But even though we know those things and we would never sort of deny them, and if we're asked, do we believe those things are real, we'd probably say yes. The question I'm more interested in is, what does it mean to live that way? What does it mean to actually see the world that way? Now, I don't know. For me, my sort of background as a Christian is that I've sort of come through reactions to Catholicism and the kind of perceived superstitions and things going on there. And then the reactions, on the other hand, to like the charismatic movement and the neo-Pentecostal movement and the perceived sort of excesses there. And so I'm kind of reacting against all these things. And so for me, a lot of the time, what I thought of as sensible, biblical, discerning Christianity was really just skeptical, modernist Christianity. And I know that there are evangelicals and Christians from other traditions who are not going to have this problem, right? Like I say, if you're coming from a Roman Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox background, you're probably way more comfortable with the kind of supernatural than you are if you come from a Reformed or conservative evangelical background. Similarly, that if you come from a Pentecostal charismatic background, you're way more comfortable and probably way more way more mindful of these things than you are if you're from a reformed or conservative background. And I remain skeptical of some of the things going on in both of those circles, but what is happening to me now, and what I'm becoming increasingly aware of, is that some of my skepticism needs to be turned in on my own movement. I wouldn't say it's the whole reform movement as a whole, but certainly some subcultures within reformed or conservative evangelicalism that seem to operate like functional theists, right? We believe God is out there. We just don't believe that there is any real interaction with me or my world. This has kind of been exacerbated by a few things. So Christian Smith, the sociologist, has described American religion, American Christianity, as moralistic therapeutic deism. Sorry, I should have said deism earlier, not theism. Anyway, maybe I'll edit that, maybe I won't. Well done for making it this far. So moralistic therapeutic deism, and the problem with that is that moralistic therapeutic deism is sort of feeding into this idea that the Christianity that we really want or believe is useful in our world is not one where God actually interacts with us, or the supernatural really interacts with the natural. It's just kind of God is out there, sets things in motion, tells us how to live to have a happy life, and that's really what it's about. That's all it is. And of course, there's some big problems with that. If that is what we think Christianity is, God is out there, tells us how to live so that we can be happy. The kind of Bible as instruction manual for the Christian life sort of thing. I mean, just problematic. It isn't the Christian faith, as I hope as we go through this podcast and through the other podcasts, 2H Sojourner. I'm hoping that these things are becoming clear. But what I want to do here is just focus on what is it that Christians should believe about reality. So rather than just reacting against Catholicism and its excesses, and reacting against Pentecostalism or charismatic movements and its excesses, and by the way, that's come into scrutiny again recently with the whole Mike Winger thing and the kind of exposing of just fake prophecies and fake miracles, which is the kind of thing that people in my camp, the kind of conservative or reformed evangelical world, have always kind of been keen to point out that most of that stuff going on, claiming to be miraculous in some circles, is just faking it. It's just charlatan stuff. And so, however, we shouldn't let that make us so skeptical that we don't believe in anything authentic. And then same with Roman Catholicism. There's some things like seeing the Mother Mary in an oven tray bake and thinking that it's a divine visitation is one thing, but there are some genuine engagement with the supernatural there as well. And so we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but neither do we want to form our view of reality simply by pushing it over and against views that we disagree with. If you're tracking with me, if you see what I mean, if you're catching what I'm throwing at you. So, do we live like functional deists? Do we live as though God is there but doesn't really interact with us? If someone observed your life, or if you just reflect over the last week, does it reflect the kind of life that is convinced of a universe filled with supernatural realities, as in, a universe of things visible and invisible? Or is Christianity simply a moral philosophy? Or is Christianity simply a therapeutic philosophy? Or is Christianity simply a kind of reaction, or a kind of rebranded skepticism, a rebranded modernism that is trying to be rationalistic or appealing to the atheist crowd, to show how credible Christian belief is, and maybe sacrificing a little too much of the weird stuff in order to come across that way? Now, this question has been bothering me for a long, long while. It's been bothering me for years. And actually, I blame the current seminary that I'm part of, King's Evangelical Divinity School, a great online master's degree. I highly recommend it. But I had to write a paper for that on the influence of modernism on the way that we interpret the Bible. And that was a paper that really did get me thinking in all kinds of ways, because It made me aware that every generation has had philosophies and movements that have influenced the way that they read the Bible. But what is the philosophy that influences the way you read the Bible? And when you start to think about that, it must be there, but you might not be conscious of what it is. And this, I think, builds on what we spoke about last week. If you haven't seen the first episode, which is on the experience of disenchantment, really, in some ways, I'm just building on that and trying to dig a little bit now into Christian theology about why it is that the experience of disenchantment, the experience of beginning to see the world as in simply just terms of stuff. What is everything made of? How does it work? Rather than in terms of what does it mean? Why is it there? And so this is kind of building on that and just double clicking on it a little bit. And I want to introduce you to two theologians, well, three, but just for now, two theologians who in some sense have been commenting on this and I've been interacting with a little bit. And the one is the scholar Michael Heiser, the late Michael Heiser. Sadly, he's gone to be with the Lord. Sad for us, not for him. But he's a guy I would have loved to have had around so I could ask him more questions about the stuff that he's written. There is a very strange reaction to Michael Heiser in the Reformed camp, in the kind of conservative evangelical camp. People seem very reluctant to go there. To be honest, it's with the way people react to him makes no sense to me whatsoever. Michael Heiser, he gets, in other words, what I'm trying to say is I don't think any of the skepticism or the hate that he gets is even slightly justified. He is a very, very compelling read. He's a solid biblical scholar. He knows his stuff with Hebrew. All the things that he posits in his works are based on good scholarship. I've double checked. And these are kind of like known things in the academic world. So he's not actually said anything novel or new. These are just kind of like scholarly assumptions that are going on. And so we're going to dive into some of those things. But Michael Heiser's Unseen Realm is really a phenomenal book. But he has this whole thing where he identifies this problem in the evangelical world, that really we've lost our sense of the supernatural worldview of the biblical authors. So he was a young guy. He's handed Psalm 82 and he's studying it in Hebrew. And he's struck by the line that God has taken his place in the divine council in the midst of the gods, the Elohim, he holds judgment. And so this God standing in the assembly of gods, and the word God and the word gods are the same word, Elohim. And he's struck by this reading in Hebrew, and it's blowing his mind, and he digs into this. And that really is the groundwork. Now, Meredith Klein is another Old Testament scholar who's been a huge influence on me. And he has, again, Heiser is not saying anything at this level that I think Klein is not saying. So I was well and truly prepared for this. And so the idea of the divine council and the idea of God in the assembly of divine beings, or the assembly of angels, or the assembly of gods, or however you want to translate the term Elohim, I think that is, pretty standard stuff to me, but really important for Heiser, because he realized that he'd read that psalm so many times before, but he'd never actually seen it. He'd never clocked the reality of it. And so he began to ask questions about why that is. How is it that here is a profound text describing the way God operates in this divine council, and yet this has kind of never come across to him. Now, I think that one of the joys of being a Christian is that we're constantly learning, and there's things that we read the same Bible passage, 50, 60, 70 times, and new things occur to us. So it's not always a good idea to like rebuild your whole theological system on something, but at the same time, he's putting his finger on something. Maybe we've learned to read the Bible through modern Western assumptions, modern Western culture, through kind of the development of evangelical culture in the West, which is heavily influenced by modernism, heavily influenced by rationalism and the Enlightenment, rather than reading it through the eyes of the original biblical authors. So the things that appear strange to us and wonderful to us, and so therefore we kind of just brush away or don't take note of, maybe those things need to get brought back into focus and to realize that they were part of the belief system of the biblical authors. Another theologian so the thing about Heiser is he's very much let's just follow the Bible, and if that means that tradition is wrong, so be it. That's one way of reading the Bible. A little bit more of a kind of solo scriptura way, which I'm sort of not entirely comfortable with, but it's a thoroughly evangelical way of reading the Bible, and he is basically picking up on modernism is killing the way that we're reading the Bible, and it's causing us to have a disenchanted reading of the Bible. We're kind of not seeing the supernatural stuff that's there. But then also you've got someone like Hans Boersma, who's a totally different kettle of fish, right? So Hans Boersma is a Reformed guy who went High Church Anglican, and his whole angle as well is not so much from the kind of Old Testament exegetical level. He's more of a kind of theologian, philosopher. He's more interested in retrieving for evangelicals the great tradition. And so in Heavenly Participation, he argues that for something he calls the sacramental tapestry, a vision of creation as kind of woven into and participating in and pointing beyond itself toward God and the heavenly world. So on this older view, the things of earth are not sealed off from heaven; they're kind of porous to it. And some of you might be aware of sort of Charles Taylor at this point and his view of the porous self, and as opposed to the buffered self. And I'm just going to press pause on Charles Taylor because we'll have to come back to him another time. But man, but now Hans Boersma is basically identifying the same thing, that the impact of modernism on the way that we read the Bible and but not only the way we read the Bible, but the way we read reality. We've stopped seeing all of the cosmos as participating in the divine. We're starting to treat the world as if it's a kind of distinct, separate entity that's kind of self-sufficient. It kind of runs on its own, the deist God. And the problem with that is the moment anything becomes not sort of, or it becomes independent of the sustaining, creating work of the creator, it becomes like another God. And so obviously you can't have that, right? So you have to have creation as being sustained all the time, continuously by God. So it's interwoven, and God has made creation in a way so that it's constantly pointing beyond itself to the supernatural world beyond, to the invisible realm, but ultimately and most gloriously pointing to Christ, who is the creator and sustainer of all things. So, do we see the world? If you look out your window, you look at the trees, you look at everything, you look at yourself, do you see a world that is filled with visible signs that are pointing us to invisible realities? Are you seeing creation as a window rather than a wall? And so that you've got different diagnoses in a sense. You've got Heiser, who works from sort of exegesis apart from tradition, and you've got Boersma, who is seeking to retrieve tradition to help us to become better exegetes, and I'm much more comfortable with that. And yet they're both putting their finger on the same problem. Modernism has had a huge effect on evangelicals, by which I think I'm not entirely certain what kind of evangelicalism Heiser comes from. I know Boersma at least comes from a kind of more reformed, confessional reform background, but has kind of moved to Anglo-Catholicism, which is, I guess, arguably still in the reformed world. So they're both putting their finger on the same issue. So I guess the question that I'm wanting to drop into your mind now is that what do you see as real, and are you truly allowing the Bible to determine what you believe to be real in the world around you, even right now? Even right now. So what is real around you now? Is it only the things you can see and touch and feel with your physical senses? Are there other things that are real around you? Do you see everything around you as somehow pointing beyond itself, or do you see it as an end in itself? These are key questions for determining whether or not we have a kind of Christian metaphysic, a Christian view of ontology, of what is real, what is being. So I want to kind of, at this point, just begin to explore this and introduce you to another scholar who has helped me massively, which is Meredith Klein. So he develops this idea of the cosmos that has basically two registers. So Meredith Klein, it's a kind of riff on visible and invisible, which you'll find in Colossians, but you'll also find in the Nicene Creed. The creation has these two parts. It's clear that from Colossians, it's kind of an exposition of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth, which in one sense is is describing everything, and so is just talking about everything. But in another sense, God made the heavens and the earth is describing the two fundamental aspects of the one cosmos. So in the same way that we are kind of soul and body together in one union, we are a kind of monistic dual or a dualistic whole, or however you want to, we're going to get to that. But the world is in the same way. It's kind of like body and soul in that sense. It is visible and invisible. It is heaven and earth. And so it's a remarkable word, that invisible. And Klein links that to his kind of two registers, the upper register and the lower register, the upper register being the invisible realm, and then the lower register being the visible realm. And the upper register, the invisible realm, is a remarkable realm. It is not imaginary. It's not symbolic. It is real. It is just invisible to us. And that invisibility is something we're going to explore in the future for sure. Why is it invisible to us? How come sometimes it seems like it's not invisible to us? And all that I want to look into. But for now, let's just stay on track. So the biblical writers, when they write, they simply assume that God's creation contains realities that we cannot ordinarily see, right? It contains realms that we can't see. It contains beings that you can't see. And it also believes that there are invisible events that happen. There are things that happen that are hugely significant, which we can't see. So I'm thinking particularly of things like rituals that we go through, baptism, Lord's Supper. These are or repentance, coming to faith. These involve the invisible realm in ways that we don't often appreciate. And so what I hope we'll begin to see, though, is that these aren't like strange side topics for those who are kind of bored of thinking about the gospel. These are woven through the entire biblical story. They are central to the gospel. And so you simply cannot think about the gospel without thinking about the invisible realm. You certainly can't understand it. In fact, is it even the gospel without this invisible realm? And so as I say it, this should become obvious, but I hope that by saying it and by stating it and by just kind of dropping this little thought, the seed in here, that you might begin to start thinking that that reality and the gospel, the invisible realm, the unseen realm, as Heiser calls it, the upper register, as Klein calls it, the sacramental tapestry, as Boersma calls it, these things are central to us as Christians, not side issues. And so let's just acknowledge that. And then knowing that, then how does that cause you to rethink all of your major belief systems or doctrines in a more thoroughly biblical way? So the one creation, two registers, one creation, one cosmos, visible and invisible, one cosmos, two realms, one creation, two registers. These sorts of phrases will keep coming back to as a way of just reminding us of this reality, that what is real is not simply what you can see and feel and touch. And you might be watching this as a Christian and you kind of know this in your head, but what I'm trying to get is past your head to see that, not just to the point where you know it, but to the point where you understand it, you perceive its meaning, to go from apprehension to comprehension in that sense. And if you're watching this and you're not a Christian and you're perhaps more attracted to other forms of spirituality than Christianity. I mean, this is the great tragedy for me, right? Is that people are put off from some parts of the Christian faith because the claims to engage with the supernatural are so obviously superficial. They normally involve around getting more money or something like that. And then and that is a real put off for someone who's genuinely seeking to encounter the divine. And we know that people are genuinely seeking this experience. They want to know the divine. They want to be spiritual. They want to engage with that thing. They believe it's there. They know it. They feel it in their hearts. They just don't know how. And so they're reaching out through all these kind of other mediums, perhaps because they've rejected those kind of faux spirituality things coming out of some ultra charismatic groups. But then they've also maybe walked into a kind of Reformed Baptist church and just thinking, man, this is just stuffy and staid and rigid and formal, and there's no sense of the divine here. Or like this feels materialistic in another way. It just seems to be all about rules and regulations. And so that's been a kind of turnoff. For someone who's genuinely seeking to cultivate a spiritual life, that seems like a place where you're not going to be able to do that. And that is a great shame, because Christianity is the place where we truly can know the divine. That is the extraordinary thing about it. We can know Christ. We can know our Creator. We can commune with all of the cloud of witnesses and the saints and the angels. And we're going to come back to what that means, but just we can have communion in that world. It's such a deep, rich spiritual world, but it gets lost in the confusion of kind of the groups trying to pretend to be spiritual, but perhaps not getting it right in the right ways, and then the groups that are not even trying anymore. And let's just try and figure out what is a kind of true spirituality that the Bible wants us to cultivate. And I'm doing this, unashamedly from a kind of conservative evangelical, reformed evangelical background. We'll come back to talk about evangelicalism, because that is a slippery little rascal, that one. But we'll come back to that. So, now, if we start to think about how this affects the way that we read the Bible, one of the things that Heiser really does very well is he takes you to strange passages, and then he encourages you to see those passages as a kind of window into the worldview of the biblical author, rather than just kind of dismissing it as a weird, archaic, outdated way of seeing things that's kind of like very unsophisticated and pre-modern. Actually use it as a window into the biblical world, and let that worldview of the authors and let that critique your worldview. And so he brings up the Witch of Endor, for example, which is a classic example of the kind of thing that we're told not to kind of focus on, or the kind of rich man and Lazarus. But hang on a second, these things occur at key moments within the narrative, and it even comes up explicitly in things like 1 Peter. But and the kind of, what does it mean that Christ descended to proclaim victory to those who were imprisoned, and all these kinds of things, because of their obscurity, we just kind of pass them off. And because they're difficult to understand, they don't fit within our modern evangelical scheme, we just kind of like, nah, well, that's not central, we'll just leave that to the side. But what if it is like really important to understand the central things? Like, what if the reason we don't understand those things is because we don't understand the central things as well as we'd like to think we do? I mean, I don't know. I think it's worth exploring. So I think Heiser raises a really good point there. And so I encourage you, one way we can proactively do this is just as we're reading the Bible, and we come across stuff that is weird to us, stuff that is strange to us, stuff that we think, do you know what, can this be real? Is this real? Is this just a metaphor? Like, what is going on here? Just stop and think, hang on a second. Did the biblical authors believe this? And if they did believe it, what does that mean for the way that I believe it? And why am I so convinced, maybe if I'm a skeptic, that their way is wrong and my modernist way is right? And so, yeah, we'll put that there. So just a little story about, as we start to kind of delve into this, How do we lose this? So again, this is something we're going to have to develop a little bit as we go. But how do we begin to lose this kind of sense of the sacred, sense of the spiritual world? Charles Taylor, again, he keeps making sneaky appearances. I want to focus on his work at a later point. I found it quite difficult to read, and so I'm hoping that by reading it and regurgitating it to you, it will help me to understand him, but also, maybe spare you some trouble. So, beautiful concepts, though. And one of the things that he says is that the modern person has become a buffered self. We're like sealed off. We're individuals. We're sort of impervious to the forces and spirits and meanings and symbols out there. We can kind of pick and choose what we want to let in. And our medieval ancestors or our pre-modern ancestors were very different to that. Porous, exposed, constantly influenced by spirits in the world, for good or ill. And that really shaped the way society was formed, saw the way that they expressed spirituality, the way they understood events in their lives, the way that they shaped their sense of community and everything. And so it wasn't, something has happened that's got us from that sort of pre-modern view of a world full of spiritual activity where everything is influenced by spiritual activity, to a world where nothing is influenced by that. And certainly I'm not influenced by that. So anything that influences me is internal. It's psychological rather than external, spiritual, or from external spirits. And so C.S. Lewis, in The Discarded Image, which is another work that I want to keep coming back to, but I can't avoid it here. He makes a point that will run right through this podcast, is that for the medieval Christian, you look up in the night sky and you don't look out into an empty space. You look out into the sky. You don't just look out into blank space or blue sky. There's not just emptiness there. And again, you look even within a church, you look around the church, it's not just empty. You look your house, you're looking around your house. You're not just viewing it as empty space. Air was crowded and ordered and festive and alive, and a universe filled with things. And this makes it out in that famous Shakespeare quote of there are greater things. No, I'm going to mess it up. I should not have brought it up. There are more wonderful things than in your philosophy, Horatio. You know the one I'm talking about. I'm butchering it completely, but it's that one. Look it up. Horatio, Shakespeare, you'll get it. I'm doing this on the fly, guys, so sometimes stuff gets lost. When I freestyle, I lose confidence. So the C.S. Lewis is kind of drawing attention to that. And I think that this is part of what we are afraid of as modern evangelicals, as conservative evangelicals. We're afraid of the demon behind every bush kind of mentality. Whereas that was just like the normal way of viewing the world for the first, up until like the Enlightenment. So up until, I don't know, let's just say 500 years ago. So that's pause for thought, right? I mean, we're gonna get more into that, but I'm just dropping in things here that are helping and that will hopefully help us to steer a course to a more robustly biblical worldview. And I realize that things that I'm saying now are going to be raising more questions than they're answering. But my hope is that over time we are going to begin to answer these sorts of things. I'm concerned to understand what is the world really like. And so I think modern Western culture officially tells us that only the material world is real. Everything else is psychological. It's biology, chemistry, physics. So love is just purely about what happens to your body and brain when you experience love. It's not actually a thing that exists outside of that. It's purely internal. And so let me be clear about what I'm not saying, right? This podcast and my view is not anti-science. I'm not anti-biology. I'm not saying that empirical study or physics are bad things in any way. But what I am challenging is the kind of excess, the pendulum swing that's gone too far to say that those are the only things, right? So if we're saying that matter is all there is, the material world is all there is, therefore the only kind of true knowledge is empiricism, therefore the only kind of true science is physics and biology and chemistry, then that is a problem, because that is a sub-biblical view. No wonder we're so depressed, right? So that's a world where everything is just, what is it made of and how does it work, rather than why is it there and who gave it to us, and how does this point beyond it, and what does it mean, right? So that's what we're trying to recover here. The problem is not science itself, but the kind of reductionism that says that leaps from science explains many things to science explains everything. And that leap is not a scientific finding. It's a philosophy that some scientists have. And it's a philosophy that explains less of human experience, not more. So at exactly the same time as our culture professes materialism, it is ravenous for the supernatural, right? So the more we've tried this route of, listen, the material world is all that there is, it seems the more desperate our world is to discover that that's not true. And we are desperately seeking things through spirits, through energies, through aliens, through near-death experiences, through paranormal, through ancient mysteries, through retrieving some occult practices, and through DMT and acid tripping and all that kind of stuff. People are really desperate to discover something out there, because I think deep down everybody knows it's just nonsense. It's just nonsense that the world is only matter, and that we're only what we're made of and how we work. We're not anything more than that. I think everyone intuitively knows that is wrong. The question is, what do you do with that yearning? Do you just push it down? Do you just kind of shove it to the side? What if you want a truly reliable way to discover what the mysteries of the invisible aspects of our realm? And that is, I think, what the Bible really does offer. But the Bible, as read through the great tradition, which will then expose, as we read it kind of historically, we see how it's kind of been read by Christians from every historical period. That's going to then expose the kind of blind spots that we have in our historical period. It's going to help us to understand how modernist philosophy is impacting us and postmodern philosophy is impacting us, rather than simply seeing it as us being truly objective readers of the Bible for the first time in history. And so we live in a world that is both a culture in the West that is both materialistic and mystical. We've kind of rejected the Christian worldview because we don't believe true spirituality can be found there, but we're still searching, and we haven't found it anywhere else, but we know it's out there. And so I hope that this will be something that will just realize, will help you to see, hang on, don't give up on Christian theology yet. It might not have been represented very well to you, but listen, there is so much mystery to explore in the Bible, in the Christian world, and in its view of reality. So just sit tight. And so let's not, where does this leave us as Christians, as Reformed Christians, as evangelical Christians, as robust biblical Christians? How do we engage with this without kind of losing our marbles, so to speak? We don't want to just react by becoming suspicious of everything that's supernatural. Other times Christians chase every extraordinary story they hear. And so we don't want to become either super suspicious or just, throwing discernment out the window. There is something, we need to find another way. And so neither of those responses are particularly biblical. We don't need fear and we don't need sensationalism. We need theology. We need a robust, biblical, great tradition, theological retrieval that is going to recover the Bible's own understanding of the invisible creation. What have Christians always believed about this? What is part of the faith handed down to us? And we're in good company. So listen, here is the kind of a trailer for future episodes. The early church fathers had a far more wonderful view of the world and a far more coherent view of the world, an account of how the invisible and the visible relate to each other, than most modern Christians do. Justin Martyr, Clement, Augustine, all these guys are going to be who we explore, and I promise you it's more interesting than anything in the paranormal section of your bookshop. So that's what we're going to look into. And so, yeah, I think that's probably enough for now. But what I really want to do is kind of trace the kind of whole redemptive story. So we're going to kind of do a Bible overview, but particularly through this lens of what does the Bible teach about the visible and the invisible. I hope you'll see that this isn't just an academic exercise. This really does matter. This is going to shape the way that you think and feel about the gospel, about stuff that goes on at church, and about how to live the Christian life. And perhaps even for some of you watching, just to see how awesome life in this world can be. Now, one of my favorite verses is one we've kind of been alluding to, is Colossians, which says that for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Visible, invisible. Those two words describe the world we inhabit. Not two separate universes, one creation, two registers, one Lord, one story. So here is something small to do before the next episode. So each day, this week, just read that verse in Colossians. Maybe read it slowly. And every time you meet a reference to the invisible realm, or do you know what? Read the whole book of Colossians, actually. And anything you're reading in the Bible, anything you hear in a sermon, just notice every time the invisible realm makes an appearance. And hopefully this will help to reinvigorate your sense of wonder with the scriptures, but also with the church and with life itself. So we are all living between two realms. And so thank you for joining me. I'll see you again next time.
Still walking on.